So this week, New World launched the Brimstone Sands update. This is the largest single content patch they've had since release, and it brings a ton of new stuff. There is the whole new zone of Brimstone Sands, a desert-themed area with a new quest line, enemies, loot. They even added jumping puzzles to the game, as well as this big old sandworm that appears to likely be either an upcoming world or raid boss. And this is a fairly large area. Lots of the normal stuff you expect in New World, but about 2.5 times the size of Everfall, for example. It's a big zone with a lot of content. Also in this zone is the new expedition, the Ennead, a new group dungeon with a boss and mechanics to learn, some new puzzles, and of course the whole reason you're there is for some brand new loot, which includes the addition of a new weapon, the Great Sword, a big old two-handed sword that has both DPS and tanking potential that scales with strength and dexterity. And then, and this is the big thing here, they added these items called heart gems. They're kind of like mini ultimates. These are items that act as a brand new skill for your character. They will charge up in combat and then once full can be activated. Now there are 5 major heart gem abilities, the core abilities. There's Cannon Blast, which has you firing a large cannon. Detonate, which will explode in an area damaging anything around you. Grasping Vines summons up vines to crowd control nearby enemies. Stone Form is like the opposite of that. It makes you immune to controlling effects. And then Dark Ascent is sort of a leap ability that has you slamming down, damaging, and staggering enemies. Each of these core abilities all have 3 sub-variations adding additional effects, which basically makes for 15 new skills added to the game that you can swap and try out. Beyond all of this new content, they've also revamped the starter experience, bringing a total overhaul to the early leveling experience, streamlining things so that it all flows better and makes more sense. This includes the quest flow, moving you through the zones with a new focus on the main story. They've added more variety to the quest with dynamic things like wave events, tracking, traversal challenges, puzzles, and even more unique encounters. And they've overhauled the starting zones layout, their appearance, the content, dramatically changing things like the town's look and layouts, adding new enemies, brand new locations to discover, and new challenges. They've also, I really like this, they make it so that early on there are weapons of every type just laying around the environment that you can pick up and use rather than having to, like in the past, relying on drops to finally use the weapon that you're interested in. They're just scattered around the place for you to pick up. And all around, this is a pretty solid update, honestly. Like, new content is always nice to have, so we got a new zone, a new dungeon, and a new weapon, and new systems are even better. This heart gem system that essentially gives us 15 new skills to try out, really great addition. And that overhaul new player experience, while not so important for established players who already have max level characters, this is great for anyone new who might be jumping into the game for the first time. And also for those of us who are crazy enough to want to go through the leveling process again on the fresh start servers in a couple of weeks. Yeah, I guess it's good for us too, right? So yeah, overall, I like this update. I think it's fairly decent, but also it's not really the focus of today's video. More so, I want to talk about how the game has progressed over this past year leading up to this point, the sort of state that it's in currently, and then also look forward into the future. And maybe along the way, this might help you decide if now is a good time to jump back in. Personally, I am excited to be back into New World because yeah, there has been quite a lot added. And you know, New World might not be the perfect MMO, but I think it has come a long way and still has even more unrealized potential that, so long as Amazon doesn't completely abandon the project, may eventually become realized. But first, I've just realized it's time for a word from today's sponsor. Hey everyone, today's video is sponsored by Time Raiders. This is a mobile MMO where you go on tomb raiding adventures to uncover clues to ancient legends, unearth long-lost temples, and battle supernatural forces in your goal to become a legend. The game offers a wide range of content with daily events and challenges. PvE includes a story campaign, dungeons, and dragon hunts, whereas PvP offers stuff like duels, arenas, and even wars. There's an in-depth character creator letting you choose from a wide range of options for how you look, all sorts of crazy potential here. There's a pet system if you like stuff following you around all day, and a collecting mini game where you will seek out and uncover hidden treasures. It's got autoplay features because of course it does. This is a mobile game after all, and as such it's meant to be more of like a casual MMO experience. You can flip on autoplay and do other stuff while the game's running in the background, like you could watch YouTube or even play another game. game. So if you're interested in checking out Time Raiders for yourself, go ahead and click on the link in the video description below. Okay, so Brimstone Sands. This is the most recent in an ever-growing list of updates that have come to New World since the game released. Let's take a look at some of the highlights. So they've added multiple new expeditions. These are the dungeons in the game. There was Tempest Hearts as well as Barnacles and Black Powder. With this, dungeons are now also free to enter. So no more will you have to be farming for orbs to gain access, basically the keys to unlock playing the dungeons. You can just do the dungeons. There's just now a limit on the number that you can do. Also, every dungeon now has a fast travel point at the entrance, making arriving there a lot easier. And they finally added Group Finder. So now you have a tool that will show you a list of active groups for every potential expedition that you might want to do, making it way easier to find people to play with. They added mutated expeditions. These are harder versions, kind of like hard mode of the dungeons, mixing things up and adding to the replayability. There's all sorts of different modifiers, so enemies can be infused with different elemental effects, they can be promoted and given new abilities, and the players themselves can be cursed, which basically applies debuffs. These mutations will be rotating weekly, changing up every Tuesday morning with the weekly reset. They added instruments to the game, so you can now play music that grants buffs such as gathering luck or yield. This is a really cool inclusion. One of my favorite things about the MMO Arcade was its use of instruments to do like healing and mana restoration, and instruments for buffs is similarly a really cool idea. It's a nice little extra flavor, extra system to engage with. PvP got some additions. They added PvP arenas, these 3 versus 3 team fights in a best of 5 format with these timed 2-minute rounds, which after that timer runs up, a shrinking ring of fire appears, forcing players together and ending things more quickly. And also there's now a PvP rewards track. So if you're most interested in PvP, if that's the activity you like to do, you now basically have your own XP track as well as a special currency that's used to purchase rewards. New weapons have come to the game. So this most recent update adds the Greatsword, but they were also saw the addition of the Void Gauntlet, which was a damage and support magic hybrid, and the Blunderbuss, a ranged weapon that's actually specifically focused on mid-ranged and mobility. They've made it so that leveling in the game is easier. This was a huge critique for a very long time, especially at release, just how long and how much of a slog the mid to the end leveling was. Well, they have reduced the experience and the time required to level up your character, as well as for improving trade skills. They added cross-region transfers, making it so that you can more easily play with friends. There have been new enemies to add more variety to just the play experience, new open world activities like updated points of interest. They added a loot goblin basically called Raffle Bones. There are these new things called roadside encounters, basically like dynamic world events, and they've added these collectible things like Vista paintings scattered around the world. There's the new expertise system, which is a new form of progression for increasing your gear score at max level, and a whole new endgame loot system. Basically everything in the game, every endgame activity like open world named bosses, expeditions, the outpost rush, arenas, corrupted breaches, all of that now grants players these different types of gypsum, and that can be crafted into orbs, which then ultimately basically become a gypsum cast of any type of weapon, armor, or trinkets. And on top of this, there have been a ton of different quality of life improvements to the game, so they've made it so that storage is now linked across all territories, so it's no longer the case that you have to transfer items from one town to another. Basically, it's all just linked together. Taxes have been reduced. They're taking less money out of your pocket. Fast travel costs have been lowered, making that easier. You can also now queue for things like Outpost Rush and arenas from anywhere in the game. Players now also have an unlimited amount of tier 1 ammo, so you don't have to be focusing on crafting that or worried about running out. They've also made it so that it's now pretty darn affordable to respec, so you can try out different builds and weapon paths without worrying about sinking all of your resources into that. And then they've made some things like major crackdowns on cheating and hackers, banning a lot of people, managing people who are doing that. All of this plus an exhaustive list of balance tuning, bug fixes, combat gameplay, and quality of life improvements. And I'm talking like hundreds of pages worth of changes over this past year, adjusting and improving all of this stuff. I am not reading it all off, but in general, they have been trying to respond to community feedback. That's a lot of stuff. That is a lot of additions within the span of a year, and a lot of things that I think put it in a good direction. right up until this week with the launch of Brimstone Sands. So how is this update? Well, at the top, I ran through all of the things that were included, and it all seems good, but also pretty darn brief. My editor completely no life to this on patch day, playing from its launch right up until he passed out like a real true gamer, yeah? And he's pretty much done. Like, yes, there is new stuff he could grind for, there's more loot and things he could farm, but in about a day, he pretty much saw more or less everything this update has to offer. He completed the new story, which takes him through a series of quests throughout Brimstone, seeing all of the major points of interest, the new settlement, the new dungeon, etc. He saw the big old sandworm. This is like the highlight of this update, the big kind of world creature. It actually doesn't appear to be something that you're engaging with at the moment. It's just something that you will see in the world. We are assuming that at some point this is going to be a world boss or the raid boss potentially. He's leveled up the greatsword, that brand new weapon, playing around with the various skills in both tree lines. And he did the heart gem missions, which basically involve going through what's kind of like an open world dungeon with jumping puzzles and secret rooms that have loot, as well as the items needed to unlock the first heart gem ability, which was the cannon blast. Pretty cool. Getting the rest of these abilities and their modifiers basically just involves farming expeditions and upgrading them. He has collected most of the glyphs, which are basically keys for the zone to unlock secret areas, portals, loot, and various bosses. He did the elite zone boss fight against a giant scorpion, which he did note was more difficult than some of the elite zone boss fights in the older zones, so that is a positive. He said it was fairly challenging and took a decent number of players. And he also did the solo boss arena, which was part of the campaign. So yeah, the update seems pretty cool, and it does add a decent amount of new stuff. I am particularly happy about the new player overhaul, the new mechanic, and the heart gem, but also at the same time, it is just one new zone, and like, how much time do we realistically expect to get out of a single zone? Even though it is a big zone, 2.5 times the size as they mentioned, I don't know, like, how long would you expect to spend in 2 zones? A few days, maybe a week, depending on how much you play, but we're not talking like months or hundreds of hours worth of content here. This is just another update, and yes, a new zone is cool, but it is also, yeah, just a new zone. But don't take that the wrong way here if you're a fan of New World, because my whole point is that this one update isn't really make or break, but it is part of the larger picture of updates and also what is still to come. And in terms of improving the game and getting people liking it and back to playing it, it does seem to be working. You'll kind of remember the big narrative, the big story in the months following the release of New World was its rather dramatic drop in player count. New World loses 90% of players, everyone's left, the game's terrible. And you know, it was true. New World peaked at launch at around 1 million concurrent players, crazy high, but in the subsequent months that dropped down. The month after was 400k, the month after that 200, then down to 100, and this continued so on and so on. That decline going right up until about mid-July of this year, where the daily peak concurrent count was hovering around 20,000. That was basically its lowest peak. That makes sense. It was its lowest peak around mid-July, but it was at that point coinciding with a lot of the long list of updates that I just basically explained to you, where things started to turn around, and the game has been seeing a bit of a resurgence with those numbers steadily climbing. It averaged around 25k peak in August, 40k in early September, getting up to 50k in late September, and then as of this most recent release of Brimstone Sands, this week it peaked at over 65,000 daily concurrent players. Now that is a far cry from the nearly 1 million at release, but nevertheless, we're talking some solid numbers here. I mean, as of this recording, New World currently sits at the 11th most played game on Steam right now, just below Destiny 2, Rust, and TF2. I mean, even prior to the release of this latest update, when it was hovering around 50k, the game was regularly in the top 20 most played titles on Steam. And people like to say, oh, no one's playing the game, dead game, when it's got 40, 50k and is in the top 20, nearly now the top 10 of most played games on the entire platform of Steam, which is like the predominant PC gaming platform. You can pretend it's a dead game, but clearly there's a lot of people interested. Clearly there's a lot of people playing. And I think a lot of that has to do with their continued support of the game. It had a baseline, but there was a lot that it was lacking. And there are still things that it's lacking. It's not all rose-colored it's not all rosy. It's not all rosy. That's the phrase I'm looking for. So some of the current issues with the game that I think are worth addressing are just the fact and how the economy is tied into the wars. This was, I think, one of the bigger problems, at least for the people who stuck with the game at release. There's this whole snowball effect where you'd get the best guild on your server winning the wars, and by winning the wars, they control the territories, they get that income from the taxes, that makes them super rich, the richest people on the server, and that income continues to make them stronger, and then they just run away with control. And then all of a sudden, pretty much no one could compete, and what ended up happening is you'd see a lot of guilds when they realized that there was a dominant guild and they just couldn't catch up. It wasn't possible. They didn't have the income or the skill or whatever combination necessary, so they just left the server. They'd go somewhere else where the competition was less, or they would just stop playing, which is certainly part of the case. So that tie of economy into wars has been a major issue, and it's something they're addressing, but it still persists. Also, just the lack of large-scale group PvE content. There is no raid in the game at the moment, and even the bosses and the big fights that we have that do exist, kind of very few mechanics. There's not a ton to learn and outmaneuver. This isn't a particularly technically challenging game when it comes to the PvE side of things. And then there are some other kind of minor things that add up to the whole picture. Stuff like the fact that some of the more highly valuable resources in the game are very limited, and even if not flagged for PvP, having to deal with the competition for gathering these resources becomes a huge pain. Also, the war system, just as we thought prior to this game's launch, it is a problem where casual players basically just don't get to engage with it because they aren't invited. That doesn't seem to have been alleviated. And then in general, I think there should be more variety in terms of the game's combat and gameplay. I'll touch on exactly what I'm talking about in an upcoming bit here. And then also, this was a huge issue at release, and it still seems to plague them. They are still dealing with bugs and exploits to this day. Just as of recently, as late September, there was a massive trading exploit that they had to respond to, further damaging the game's economy. My point is that there are still certainly issues with the game and things that they need addressing, and I've only touched on some of that here. But I will say overall, my general thoughts on this game right now are pretty positive. While I don't think that this recent update alone is enough to totally revive or overhaul New World, it is a step in the right direction. These additions and changes in the Brimstone update are solid. It's a bunch of cool new stuff, and if they continue to do more like this and more like they have done over the past 13 months, I think the game is likely to see continued steady growth. Now, I would love to see one massive update with substantial changes, kind of along the lines of like a 2.0 thing, like a New World 2.0. And there are some things that aren't out yet, but that we know are in the pipeline. A lot of this information comes from some of the developer update videos, but also a press event that we took part in a couple of months ago. We sat down with some other creators and asked the developers some questions about the game and about some things that might be coming. And yeah, they've said that, hey, raids are coming. And Amazon is happy right now with the current state of expeditions, and they're moving on their focus into more raid style content. And these are going to be challenges aimed for groups of somewhere between 10 and 20 players. And they've said that we may see a glimpse of that in the near future. They were, I believe, referring to this update and specifically referring to the sandworm, quite possibly. We will see in the coming weeks and months what actually ends up happening with this part of this update. Also, mounts appear to be something in the pipeline. It's not going to be happening anytime soon, but they are in the works, they've said. They're going to be working on and have been working on fixes to things like territory management, how it ties into the economy, and the people's use of shell companies. Essentially, just a small group of players controlling the whole server, like we talked about. They're doing things to address that. And they've already done stuff to address it, like putting a cap on the taxes in the territories. I think that is a smart and a good change. Stop dominant guilds from fleecing everyone else on the server. It's a good idea. They've said that they plan on continuing to add more endgame content, and their goal for this is a quarterly basis. So whether that is expeditions or raids, they want to do that about every 3 months. That's great. And then also exotics are something that's on their radar. I didn't get a lot of clarification on that, but they are moving into that at some point in the future. So what do I think that they should do next? Like, based on how they've been moving and the things that are good, but also the things that need improvement. This is kind of my dream wish list for the game, or things that I think could certainly help improve it, right? So for one, yeah, more large-scale PvE, more raids, more world bosses. This would be great. They are doing it, they are planning, but it's still not here in the game at the moment, specifically raids. Along with this, I will say that I hope they add more into the complexity of these encounters. I know when you're dealing with like an action combat game, complexity of encounters does seem a bit limited compared to things like tab target MMOs MMOs. I do think something like, I don't know, Lost Ark, for example. It's a top-down game, yes, but it is an action game. It's not tab target, right? And I think something like Lost Ark proves that you can make really complex, really engaging raid encounters in an action MMO, and I hope New World can take some lessons from that. Actually, I hope New World can take a few lessons from ARPG-style games, right? And the other one of that would actually be just expanding upon things. So right now, New World has a fairly limited number of skills, right? You've got your basic weapon attacks, you've got your blocking, but then you only have a couple of skills, and then you're swapping between those two weapons. Now, the recent Heart Gem is a nice addition. That is a good change. It's basically an additional skill, right? I would really love to see them expand the skill trees for each weapon, like add more skills into each tree line. And even if that's not likely, what I would really love to see them do is add more unique gear that heavily modifies combat. And I'm talking learn from ARPGs where you're adding pieces of gear or weapons that like add dramatic changes. We're not talking percent scaling, damage, attack speed, cast time, a cooldown time reduction. No. I'm talking big dramatic changes that literally change a skill to almost something completely different. That would be great. If they added gear that made those kind of dramatic changes, stuff that you see in games like Diablo 3 and Path of Exile, that stuff is exciting and makes combat really engaging, and they wouldn't have to add more active skills. I think that this alone just would add so much more variety, right? You don't need to add more skill trees if you just add if you add a weapon that basically fundamentally gives you a new skill by altering an existing skill so heavily. That's something I would love to see come to the game. Also, more technical things like instanced cross-server wars, expeditions, and arenas, that would be great. They have said that this is in the works. It's in the pipeline, but no timeline given here. And then also, I think I would like to see more content specifically catered to solo players at max level. There's plenty of solo content as you're leveling up, but a lot of the max level stuff is really focused on the group stuff. And MMOs need that. It is important, and I want that as well. But also, it would be good if they cater to a lot of the solo players, because a lot of people do like to play by themselves in these games, in addition, in concert with doing the group stuff. So catering to that as well would be great. And then finally, how is New World not on console? It blows my mind. You know what? And it's funny because I just made a video about like World of Warcraft coming to console, right? I don't even really I don't play console games. I am fully a PC gamer, very, very rarely. I don't even have this generation of consoles. I have last gen of consoles. I'm not really a console gamer, but it blows my mind that New World is not on console. The gameplay, it's a third-person action game with very limited number of skills. It's like perfect for a controller. And the real reason I bring that up is because it would clearly play very well. There's really no question. This type of game plays well on a controller. And it also would open up a huge new audience. And it's the same argument I made for WoW coming to consoles. But this one is more of a no-brainer. Like, this game would clearly be perfect for a gamepad. So I think that Amazon should bring New World to console. And I could see them doing something like one big massive update. Think of like a Final Fantasy 14 complete overhaul, right? I don't know if they're going to go that far, but if we saw a massive update with a ton of new stuff, multiple zones, tons of new systems, new content overhauls, do that with a console launch, that could be one of those like New World is revived kind of situations, you know what I mean? But I think regardless of that, honestly, New World is in a pretty good spot. They've come a long way. They've made some good moves, and I think if they keep along this path, it's going to continue to grow, and it has been growing. Like I said, since mid-July, numbers have consistently gone up, and I think it's for good reason. I think because they did have a decent base, and they've continued to add to it and flush it out, and if they keep doing this, the game is going to be in a really good spot 6 months to a year from now. It already is in a pretty decent spot. I already think it's a pretty solid experience. But of course, the future of the game is unknown. It's one of those wait and see situations, but I am happy with the path that they're on. And also, I just want to touch on this here quickly. This was brought up in some of my recent coverage where people weren't happy with how a game launched, and then they say, well, because it didn't launch great, I don't want to support it at all in the future. I do not care. I do care, of course, about deceitful marketing practices. If people are promising one thing and they deliver something completely different or far below what they said, certainly, at the very least, we should chastise them for that, right? But at the same time, what I ultimately care about is a game good and is it fun to play? And so if a game launched and it didn't quite have everything to make it good and fun to play, but eventually gets there, I will play it when it gets there, and I will enjoy that process. So even though some people may be put off to New World from how it launched and all of the issues that it had, if they continue to improve it, they make it a better game, and they make it a game that is entertaining and engaging and is fun to play, bottom line, that's what I'm looking for in games, right? That's it. So if they deliver it eventually, I will play it at that point, and I will have a good time until I stop having a good time, and I'll go play something else. Because it's not like we lack video games to play, right? It's just pretty crazy. So there's a lot of games, and I think New World is shaping up pretty good. So there you go. That's it for today's video. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoy it. I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.